Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Recently, I've done a couple of videos talking about my favorite baits to match certain types of forage, and I've gotten a couple of requests for me to talk about my favorite baits that match bluegill. There are a lot of really good baits out there. Anytime you're talking about trying to mimic bluegill, lots of different types of panfish and sunfish out there. So there's really a ton of different color schemes that can come into play here. But generally speaking, there is a bluegill species, a sunfish type species that lives in all of the lakes that the bass are in, regardless of whether you live up north, live down south, out west, out east. There's bluegill pretty much everywhere. So they do play a major factor in the diet of bass species. And because of that, it is a great bait or a great choice to try to imitate those bluegill. So I do have here a couple of my absolute favorite baits that mimic any of the bluegill that are out there. Now, I do want to state, anytime you're talking about bluegill, you kind of got to identify where they're going to be located. Now, I think a lot of people just assume bluegill are generally going to be up shallow, around docks, around grass. But a lot of times during the summer, bluegill are out deeper. They can suspend out in the open water column. They can suspend off of deep weed lines. And that's where you find a good portion of the bluegill during the warmest part of the year. So just because you are fishing bluegill baits does not mean that you need to be fishing the bank where we happen to see a lot of bluegill. So just keep that in mind. Bluegill really can be scattered pretty much around the entire body of water, whether you're out on ledges or whether you're in shallow grass or pad fields. Bluegill are scattered everywhere, which again is one of the reasons why they are such a good primary forage species for bass. So let's break these baits down. I will put links for each of these in the video description. So if you want to check them out, you can go to Tackle Warehouse. If you make a purchase, you support the channel. That is awesome as well. We're going to start in no particular order. These are my probably top 5 bluegill imitating baits. The first one, a Zoom brush hog, and I really like it in the green pumpkin purple flake. You can see hopefully a little bit of small purple flake there. This bait is dynamite in terms of mimicking the bluegills, and the way I like to rig it is with a light Texas rig. So generally speaking, somewhere in that 3/16, maybe a quarter ounce unpegged bullet weight. And the reason for that is I'll throw this around laydowns. I'll throw it into areas with some grass, drag it through deep brush piles. But that bullet weight being unpegged will separate and the brush hog will just kind of glide and slide around. And it does a really good job at mimicking bluegill. I realize it's not necessarily the shape of a bluegill, but it is a bigger, bulkier bait, a couple of different, twister tail type legs on it. It just has that appearance of a bluegill sliding through a log jam. It just is a really good bait at mimicking them. A lot of times I'll dip the tails in a little bit of chartreuse dye just to make it look like the tail of a bluegill. That's one thing I love to do is take a little bit of chartreuse. And when I say dip it, I'm not talking about the 2 inches of the tail. I'm talking just the little bit of the tips of the bait. And it really generates a turquoisey look that resembles the tail of a bluegill very, very well. So I'm always going to have a brush hog rigged up. Generally, that bait works great around grass, log jams. You can pretty much fish it anywhere around cover. Again, a lot of times throughout the year, you're talking about a big percentage of the bluegill population is up shallow. Anytime you're fishing shallow cover, you should be thinking about throwing a swim jig, one of the best baits to mimic a bluegill. It's got the same profile, the same appearance. I like to match my swim jig up with a small 3.5-inch Berkeley the Deal. This is the green pumpkin. You can see that this bait has been chewed up. I cut this one off my rod. You can see how it looks like sandpapered up it is. This is just a dynamite bait. This is the core tackle. This is our new swim jig that'll be coming out in our bluegill color. Just a dynamite bluegill imitation bait. generally speaking, bluegill act very similar to largemouth in that when the water is very cold, they're going to be keying in on areas that are grabbing some warmth. So your dock posts, your thick weed clumps, your pieces of wood, around some rock as well. As the temperature warms, they'll move back into super shallow areas just like the largemouth will. They spawn in the same areas as largemouth just a little bit later, and then in through the summer months they're generally going to be in the same areas you find largemouth. And we know how good a swim jig is for largemouth in those heavy cover areas. Well, the bluegill are in those areas as well. And the reason the swim jig is so good for the largemouth is because it resembles the bluegill. So look for this guy to be coming out here probably in December at some point, but a dynamite bait. Next up, you got to have some topwaters. A topwater is a great bait to resemble bluegill because of the way bluegills feed. So often bluegill will suck at the surface or suck at the bottom of lily pads, and they're basically taking little bugs off the surface. So a topwater bait does a really good job at resembling a bluegill. And because bluegills are feeding near the surface so much, bass are looking up to come to eat them, which is why your topwaters are a good bait choice. And I had a tough choice choosing a single topwater because a lot of them are good. I really like poppers. I really like popping frogs to resemble bluegills. But one of my absolute favorite of late is this guy right here. This is the Berkeley Spin Rocket in the MF Bluegill color. If you watched my tournament recap from Lake Okeechobee, I caught a majority of my weigh-in fish on this each day, had a really good tournament. It's just one of those baits that has a very good bluegill appearance. If you are a bass looking up, it has a very good bluegill profile, meaning bluegill, when you look at them from the belly, are long, skinny species. Yes, if you're looking at them from the side, they look like a plate, but from the bottom, that's what the profile would look like. So when this is sitting on the surface, if a bass is coming up from underneath them or from, looking straight at them or from the side, they actually get a really good bluegill profile out of it. And this being roughly 4.5 inches long is the perfect size for a bass to eat. So I absolutely love this guy. This is a very tough color to find. If you can find it, I highly suggest buying it. The MF Bluegill Spin Rocket. Next up, we got a M65 Duo Realis. This is their bluegill color. Let me give it to you exactly. It's called Mirror Gill. This is a dynamite crankbait for going after some of those suspended bluegill or offshore bluegill that are off of deep weed lines. This is a crankbait that's going to get down into that 10, 11, 12-foot range, which is where a lot of your weed lines end. A lot of times those bluegill aren't necessarily glued to the bottom. They're in a big ball of bluegill that'll be just off that weed line. When I'm fishing that pattern, this is the one I'm going with. This Mirror Gill, the M65, the 11A Duo Realis, an absolute hammer crankbait that resembles bluegill so well. Again, it's kind of got a little bit more of a bulbous look. The way it comes through the water, it's not extremely wide wobbling. It's kind of a wobble with a tight roll. Just a good one. I catch a ton of bass feeding on bluegill on that bait. And then last, again, because bluegill are going to be around so much thick cover that largemouth are, your Texas rigs are going to be a great bait. And I can't say enough good things about the Berkeley Power Bait Pit Boss. This bait just does a really good job of mimicking bluegill. This is generally, I think a lot of people look at this and say it's a craw imitation bait. In my opinion, this is a bluegill imitation bait. Again, you've got a little bit wider profile with all the flappers on it. That creates a wider profile, but it gives that little kicking motion like a bait fish. And man, this is just one that, again, you tip the ends with a little bit of chartreuse, and you've got the perfect bluegill profile, the right size that most bass are going to be looking to eat. So I'm going to be flipping that around on a Texas rig, and it will generate a lot of bites where the bass are feeding on bluegill. And one other thing to note, bluegill are a primary forage year-round. I think a lot of people think bluegill are more of a forage species during the warmest part of the year. They are 100% a primary forage species for bass throughout the year, whether that's wintering or whether that's in the middle of summer. There's going to be bass around the same areas that the bluegill are, and they're there because they provide a good forage species. Not to mention they're both in the same family as well. They're all technically sunfish. So hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you are looking for some of these, click the links in the video description, hit the like button, share this, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.